The woman stumbled into Oatman, Arizona on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, her dress torn and dusty, her dark hair matted with sweat and grime, and her eyes haunted by something far worse than the 100-mile trek through the Sonoran Desert. Marshall Davis saw her first, collapsing near the water trough outside the Silver Strike Saloon, and by the time he'd gotten her to Doc Harrison's office, half the town had gathered to whisper about the mysterious stranger who'd appeared like a ghost from the wasteland. Her name was Margaret Rose, or so she claimed when she finally came to consciousness 3 hours later, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Doc Harrison spooned water into her mouth while his wife, Constance, worked to clean the dirt and blood from her skin. Margaret's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, and when the doc asked where she'd come from, she turned her face to the wall and said nothing at all. The town of Oatman wasn't much to speak of in those days, just a mining settlement nestled in the Black Mountains with about 200 souls trying to scrape silver from the unforgiving earth. Most folks minded their own business because everyone had something they'd rather forget, but Margaret Rose sparked curiosity that wouldn't die down. The women at the general store whispered that she must be running from a husband, or maybe from the law itself. The men speculated she'd been with a wagon train that got attacked by bandits or worse. Kade Yates heard about the mysterious woman 3 days after she arrived, when he came down from his cabin in the higher elevations to trade furs and pick up supplies. He was a mountain man through and through, standing 6 feet 4 inches with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer without breaking stride. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his arms were thick with muscle from years of splitting wood, hunting, and surviving alone in the wilderness. His beard was full, but trimmed close enough to see the strong line of his jaw, and his gray eyes held the kind of quiet intensity that came from a man who'd learned to read the land and trust his instincts above all else. "Heard you got a stranger in town," Kade said to Marshall Davis as he loaded sacks of flour and coffee onto his pack mule. "Woman who won't talk." The marshal, a weathered man in his 50s with a silver badge pinned to his vest, nodded slowly. "Margaret Rose. That's all we got out of her. Been here 3 days and barely said 10 words. Doc's wife tried to get her to open up, but she just stares out the window like she's waiting for something terrible to come through that door." Kade tied off the last rope securing his supplies. "She hurt anybody?" "No, nothing like that. Just scared. Real scared. The kind of scared that makes a person look over their shoulder every 5 minutes. Marshall Davis pulled out his pipe and tamped tobacco into the bowl. "Got her staying at the boarding house for now. Mrs. Fletcher's keeping an eye on her, trying to fatten her up some. Woman's skin and bones." Kade didn't think much more about it until he was leaving the general store and nearly collided with a woman coming out of the boarding house across the street. She was thin, painfully so, with hollows under her cheekbones that spoke of long hunger. But even in her weakened state, there was something striking about her. Dark brown hair that would probably shine like mahogany when it was clean and healthy, delicate features that might have been pretty if they weren't drawn so tight with tension, and green eyes that held depths of sorrow he recognized all too well. Those eyes met his for just a moment, and Kade felt something shift in his chest. He'd been alone on his mountain for 8 years, ever since he'd left Missouri after the war, and he'd convinced himself he preferred it that way. People were complicated. People lied and hurt each other and left scars that never quite healed. The wilderness was honest in its brutality, and he understood it. But this woman, this Margaret Rose with her haunted eyes and secrets, made him want to know more. She broke the gaze first, ducking her head and hurrying back inside the boarding house like she'd seen a monster instead of a man. Kade stood there for a moment longer, then shook his head and mounted his horse. It wasn't his business. He had his own life up in the mountains, his own peace he'd worked hard to build. He didn't need complications. He made it about 5 miles out of town before he turned his horse around. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Fletcher, a kind-faced widow who took in travelers and long-term lodgers to make ends meet. She answered Kade's knock with a surprised expression that quickly turned knowing. "Mr. Yates, what brings you back to town so soon? Forget something?" "The woman," Kade said plainly. He'd never been good at pretty words or social graces. "Margaret Rose. I'd like to speak with her." Mrs. Fletcher's expression grew cautious. Now, Mr. Yates, I don't think that's a good idea. The poor dear is barely holding herself together as it is, and having a large man like yourself show up at her door might frighten her even more." "I'm not here to frighten her," Kade said quietly. "I'm here to help if she needs it." Something in his tone must have convinced the older woman, because she sighed and stepped back from the door. "She's in the room at the end of the hall. But I'm warning you, Mr. Yates, you go easy. That girl's been through something terrible, even if she won't tell us what." Kade found Margaret sitting in a rocking chair by the window, staring out at the dusty street below. She didn't turn when he knocked softly on the doorframe, though her shoulders tensed at the sound. "Madam," he said carefully, "my name's Kade Yates. I saw you earlier today, and I wanted to make sure you're all right." "I'm fine." Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough from disuse. "Please leave." "Can't do that just yet." Kade leaned against the doorframe, keeping his distance. "See? I know what it looks like when someone's running from something. I've been there myself. And I know that look in your eyes, the one that says you're waiting for whatever you left behind to catch up with you." Margaret's hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right, I don't. But I know Oatman, and I know these mountains. If you need somewhere safe to go, somewhere nobody would think to look, I can help you." Finally, she turned to look at him, those green eyes searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or trustworthiness. Whatever she was looking for, she must not have found it, because she turned back to the window. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Kade considered the question. It was a fair one. "Because somebody helped me once, when I needed it. Figured I ought to pass that along." "Nobody can help me." The words came out flat, emotionless. "Nobody should try." He pushed off from the doorframe, respecting her wish for him to leave, but paused in the hallway. "If you change your mind, I'll be at the Silver Strike tonight before I head back up the mountain. Offer stands until I leave at dawn." Kade spent the evening nursing a whiskey at the saloon, playing cards with some of the miners, and listening to their stories about the silver veins they were chasing. He didn't expect Margaret to show up, so when the saloon doors swung open near midnight and she stood there in a borrowed dress that hung loose on her frame, he was genuinely surprised. Every conversation in the saloon died as the men turned to stare. Women didn't usually come into the Silver Strike unless they were the working girls who entertained upstairs, and Margaret clearly wasn't one of them. She looked terrified but determined, her eyes finding Kade at the back table. He stood immediately, gathering his winnings and tipping his hat to the other players. "Gentlemen, I'll have to call it a night." Margaret waited by the door, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the evening. Kade guided her outside with a gentle hand on her elbow, noting how she flinched at even that small touch. "Changed your mind?" he asked once they were on the wooden sidewalk, away from prying ears. "I can't stay here," she said quietly. "They'll find me here. This is one of the first places they'll look." "Who's looking for you?" She shook her head violently. "I can't tell you that. It's better if you don't know. Better if nobody knows." Kade studied her for a long moment. Every instinct he'd honed over years in the wilderness told him this woman was in real danger, the kind that didn't go away just because you ran from it. He also knew that secrets had a way of getting people killed, especially out here where life was already hanging by a thread. But something in those green eyes, that desperate hope fighting against complete despair, made him nod. All right. You don't have to tell me anything. But if you're coming with me, you need to understand something. My cabin is a full day's ride up into the mountains, and it's not easy living. It's isolated, it's hard work, and winter up there can kill you if you're not prepared. I can keep you safe from whoever's chasing you, but you'll have to pull your weight. I'm not running a charity." "I can work," Margaret said quickly. "I'm not afraid of hard work. I just need somewhere to go where they won't find me." "Then get whatever belongings you have and meet me at the stables in an hour. We'll leave before dawn." Margaret nodded and hurried back toward the boarding house. Kade watched her go, then went to make arrangements for a second horse and additional supplies. He tried not to think too hard about what he was doing, inviting a complete stranger with dangerous secrets into his carefully constructed solitude. But he'd made the offer, and Kade Yates was a man who kept his word. Mrs. Fletcher was waiting for him when he came to collect Margaret, her expression worried. "Mr. Yates, are you sure about this, taking that poor girl up to your cabin, just the two of you? People will talk. Let them talk, Kade said simply. She needs help and I can provide it. That's all there is to it. The older woman pressed a bundle into his hands. Extra food and some of my preserves. You take care of her, you hear. And Margaret, dear, you send word if you need anything. Mr. Yates comes to town often enough. Margaret hugged the woman quickly, the first affection Kade had seen her show anyone. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Fletcher. You've been very kind. They rode out of Oatman just as the first hints of gray touched the eastern sky. Kade set a steady pace, not too fast, but not dawdling either. Margaret handled her horse competently enough, which was a relief. At least he wouldn't have to worry about her falling off and breaking her neck on the mountain trails. As the sun rose higher, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, Kade noticed Margaret kept looking back over her shoulder. Each time, her face grew more anxious, and her hand would drift to the small bag of belongings tied to her saddle, as if making sure it was still there. Nobody's following us, he said, after the 10th time she'd checked their back trail. I've been watching. We're alone. You can't know that for sure. I can, actually. I've spent 8 years in these mountains, and I know how to read signs. There's no dust cloud, no movement that shouldn't be there, no tracks but ours. Whatever you're running from, it hasn't caught up yet. Margaret didn't look convinced, but she stopped checking quite so often. By midday, when they stopped to water the horses at a small spring, she finally spoke more than a few words at a time. How long have you lived alone up here? Since 1870. Came out here after the war, spent a couple years drifting, then found my spot in the mountains and built a cabin. Been there ever since. Don't you get lonely? Kade considered the question while he refilled his canteen. Sometimes. But loneliness is better than the alternative. People are complicated, and complications get you killed or hurt out here. Then why did you offer to help me? He looked at her directly, noting the genuine curiosity in her expression. Because sometimes, the right thing to do is complicated, and you do it anyway. They rode in silence for several more hours, climbing higher into the mountains where the air grew cooler and pine trees replaced the scrub brush of the lower elevations. Margaret's posture gradually relaxed as they got farther from civilization, though Kade noticed she still startled at sudden noises like a bird taking flight or a branch snapping. The cabin came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. It was sturdy and well-built, constructed from pine logs Kade had cut and hauled himself. Smoke would curl from the stone chimney in winter, and a small garden plot beside the structure showed where he grew vegetables in the short mountain summer. A lean-to stable provided shelter for his horse and the mule, and beyond that, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions. It's beautiful, Margaret breathed, and Kade felt an unexpected surge of pride at her words. It's home, he said simply. Come on, let's get the horses settled and I'll show you around. The cabin interior was sparse but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, and a smaller room off to the side that Kade used for storage. Everything was organized with military precision, a habit he'd never quite shaken from his years as a soldier. You'll take the loft, Kade said, already moving supplies to clear space. It's warmer up there and more private. I'll sleep down here by the fire. I don't want to put you out of your own bed, Margaret protested. You're not. I've slept in worse places than a bedroll by a warm hearth. He climbed the ladder and began arranging blankets and furs into a comfortable sleeping space. There's a stream about 100 yards to the east where you can wash up and get water. I'll show you in the morning. For tonight you must be exhausted from the ride. Margaret did look exhausted, dark circles under her eyes made even more prominent by the fading light. But she also looked more peaceful than she had in Oatman, as if the isolation itself was a balm to her frayed nerves. Kade prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, along with fresh bread Mrs. Fletcher had packed for them. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. Thank you, Margaret said finally, setting down her empty plate, for bringing me here, for not asking questions. Everyone's got a past, Kade replied. Mine's got plenty of dark corners I don't talk about. Figure you're entitled to the same courtesy. She looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes. Most people want to know. They push and pry until they find out what you're hiding. I'm not most people. The next few days fell into an easy rhythm. Kade rose with the dawn to check his trap lines and hunt, while Margaret took over the domestic tasks of cooking and maintaining the cabin. She proved to be an excellent cook, much better than Kade had ever been, and she worked tirelessly at every task he gave her. Washing clothes in the cold stream, tending the garden, preserving meat for the coming winter, all of it she did without complaint. But the shadows never quite left her eyes, and she still jumped at unexpected sounds. On the fourth evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant purples and oranges, Kade finally broke the careful silence they'd maintained about her past. "You don't have to tell me what you're running from," he said quietly. "But I need to know if whoever's chasing you is likely to hurt other people to get to you. The folks in Oatman, they're good people. If your trouble might spill over onto them, I need to prepare for that." Margaret was quiet for so long, Kade thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "They'll hurt anyone who gets in their way. They've already killed people looking for me. That's why I can't stay anywhere long, why I can't let anyone get close. Everyone who tries to help me ends up dead." "Then maybe it's time someone helped you who's harder to kill," Kade said matter-of-factly. "I survived 4 years of war and 8 years alone in these mountains. I'm not easy prey. You don't understand what they're capable of. So tell me." She turned to look at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "His name is Richard Sutton. He owns half of California, mines and railroads and politicians, and he murdered my sister." The story came out in fits and starts, painful words dragged from a place of deep trauma. Margaret's sister, Catherine, had been married to Richard Sutton, a wealthy industrialist who presented himself as a pillar of society while hiding a cruel and violent nature behind closed doors. Catherine had endured 3 years of abuse before she finally tried to leave, and Sutton had killed her for it. He'd made it look like an accident, a fall down the stairs. But Margaret had been there. She'd seen everything. "I was visiting her in Sacramento," Margaret said, her voice hollow with remembered horror. "I heard her screaming and I ran to help. I saw him at the top of the stairs, saw him push her. She fell and her neck broke, and he just stood there, looking at her body like it was an inconvenience he'd have to clean up." "And he saw you," Kade finished grimly. Margaret nodded. "He saw me. I ran, got out of the house before his men could catch me. I've been running ever since. That was 4 months ago. He has people everywhere, Kade. He has money and power and connections. He's hunting me because I'm the only witness to what he did, the only person who can prove he murdered Catherine. Why not go to the law?" She laughed bitterly. "The law? He owns the law. The sheriff in Sacramento is on his payroll, and half the judges, too. I tried in the beginning. I went to the federal marshal and told him everything, and 2 days later there was an attempt on my life. The marshal's deputy told me to leave town and never come back if I wanted to live." Kade absorbed this information, his mind already working through the implications. A man like Richard Sutton, with that kind of power and reach, would indeed stop at nothing to eliminate a witness. He'd have hired killers, bounty hunters, men who could track a person across the entire country if the price was right. "How did you end up in Arizona?" "I kept moving south and west, trying to stay ahead of them. I heard Oatman was remote enough that I might be able to disappear for a while. I didn't count on being so weak when I arrived that everyone would notice me." "And now you're here, in a cabin so remote that most people don't even know it exists." Kade stood and began pacing, his mind working through possibilities. "It's good cover for now, but if Sutton's people are as thorough as you say, they'll eventually check every town and settlement in the territory. When they hit Oatman again, someone will remember the strange woman who left with the mountain man." Margaret's face crumpled. "I should leave. I shouldn't have come here. I'm putting you in danger." "Too late for that now," Kade said, and there was something almost like amusement in his tone. "You're here. I offered to help, and I don't go back on my word. We'll just have to make sure Sutton's men don't find what they're looking for." Over the next several weeks, Kade set about making Margaret as invisible as possible. He taught her to move through the forest without leaving obvious signs, to cover her tracks and read the land the way he did. She learned to shoot, first with a rifle and then with a revolver he gave her to carry at all times. She learned to hunt and trap, to preserve food and tan hides, to survive in the wilderness with nothing but her wits and skill. And as they worked together, something began to grow between them that neither had expected. It started small, little moments that accumulated like gold dust in a miner's pan. The way Margaret's face lit up when she successfully shot her first rabbit. The sound of Kade's rare laughter when she told stories about her childhood in Boston. The comfortable silences that stretched between them in the evenings as they worked on separate tasks, content in each other's presence. Kade found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin after checking his trap lines, knowing Margaret would be there with hot coffee and a warm smile. He started taking more care with his appearance, trimming his beard more carefully and washing more often. He built furniture for the cabin, a proper bed frame for the loft and a rocking chair by the fireplace, telling himself it was just practical improvements, but knowing deep down he was trying to make the space more comfortable for her. Margaret began to relax, the constant tension in her shoulders easing as weeks passed without any sign of pursuit. Her nightmares became less frequent, and the hollows in her cheeks filled out as she regained the weight she'd lost during her flight across the territory. She sang while she worked, old songs from her childhood, and the sound of her voice made the cabin feel less like a hermit's retreat and more like a home. It was October when Kade finally admitted to himself that he'd fallen in love with her. They were working together to prepare firewood for winter, Kade splitting logs while Margaret stacked them against the cabin wall. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow, and the aspens had turned brilliant gold against the dark green of the evergreens. Margaret was laughing at something Kade had said, her face flushed with exertion and joy, and he realized with startling clarity that he would do anything to keep her safe, to keep that smile on her face. The realization terrified him. He'd spent 8 years building a life that didn't need anyone else, convincing himself that isolation was safety. But Margaret had slipped past every defense he'd constructed, and now the thought of losing her felt like it would tear something vital from his chest. He must have been staring because Margaret stopped stacking wood and looked at him with concern. "Kade, are you all right?" "Fine," he managed, turning back to the woodpile with perhaps more force than necessary. "Just thinking." "About what?" "Everything," he wanted to say. "About how you've changed everything. About how I'm terrified of losing you. About how I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life and see you in my cabin, in my life, in my heart. Instead," he said, "winter's coming early this year. I can feel it in the air. We'll need more wood than I usually cut." If Margaret was disappointed by his answer, she didn't show it. She just nodded and went back to stacking, but Kade thought he saw something in her eyes, a flash of emotion that might have been disappointment or might have been something else entirely. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Margaret finally broke the comfortable silence. "Kade, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you really come back to town that day when you offered to help me?" Kade studied the flames, choosing his words carefully. "Told you. Someone helped me once and I wanted to pass it along." "That's what you said, but I don't think that's the whole truth." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw in her expression that she already knew the answer. She'd known for a while, probably. Women were perceptive about these things, much more so than men. "I saw something in your eyes," he admitted quietly. "Recognition, maybe. I knew that look because I've worn it myself, the look of someone who's lost everything and is trying to find a reason to keep going." "And you wanted to give me that reason?" "I wanted to try." Margaret moved from her chair to sit beside him on the floor near the hearth, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body but not quite touching. "You saved my life, you know, not just by bringing me here, but by giving me hope that maybe I could survive this, that maybe there's still something worth living for." "You always had something worth living for," Kade said firmly. "You just needed time and space to remember it." "I'm starting to remember," she whispered. Then, before he could process what was happening, she leaned in and kissed him. It was soft and tentative, a question rather than a demand. Kade froze for half a heartbeat, his mind racing through 1,000 reasons why this was a bad idea, why they should maintain distance, why loving someone meant opening yourself up to loss and pain. Then he stopped thinking and kissed her back. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she melted against him with a small sound of relief. The kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and desperate, months of unspoken longing finally finding expression. Kade's hand tangled in her hair, now glossy and healthy, and Margaret's fingers gripped his shirt like she was afraid he might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kade rested his forehead against hers. "Margaret, I know," she said softly. "I feel it too. I've been falling in love with you since the day you offered to help me without asking for anything in return. You made me feel safe for the first time in months, and then you made me feel alive again." "This is dangerous," Kade said, even as he tightened his hold on her. "Sutton's still out there. Your life is still in danger. Loving me just gives you one more thing to lose." "Then I guess we'll have to make sure I don't lose you," Margaret replied, "because I'm not giving this up. I'm not giving you up. Not after everything I've been through to get here." They made love that night with a tenderness that surprised them both, taking time to explore and memorize each curve and plane of each other's bodies. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the loft, Margaret's head on Kade's broad chest while he ran his fingers through her hair. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we live," Kade said simply. "We take each day as it comes and build something worth protecting. And if Sutton's men come looking, we'll be ready." Winter arrived 2 weeks later with a vengeance, dumping 3 feet of snow in a single storm and effectively cutting off the cabin from the outside world. Kade had prepared well, as he always did, with enough supplies to last until spring if necessary. But having Margaret there transformed the long winter months from something to be endured into something almost magical. They spent the days working together on indoor projects, Margaret learning to tan hides while Kade repaired equipment and carved small wooden items to trade in town come spring. The evenings were spent in conversation, sharing stories of their pasts or in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. And the nights were for holding each other close, finding warmth and comfort and love in the circle of each other's arms. Margaret told him more about her life before the tragedy that had set her running. She'd grown up in Boston, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, and had come west with Catherine when her sister married Sutton. She'd worked as a teacher herself in a small school for miners' children in Sacramento, and had loved it. She spoke wistfully of the children she'd taught, wondering what had become of them after she'd disappeared. Kade, in turn, shared pieces of his own past that he'd buried deep for years. He'd been a soldier in the Union Army, fighting through some of the bloodiest battles of the war. He'd seen friends die, had killed men whose faces still haunted his dreams, and had come west to escape the memories. His family back in Missouri had disowned him for fighting for the North, leaving him truly alone in the world. "We're both refugees," Margaret said one evening as snow fell softly outside the window. "Running from different things, but running nonetheless." "Maybe we've run far enough," Kade replied. "Maybe this is where we stop and make our stand." As winter deepened and the new year of 1879 arrived, Kade began to let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd found safety. The snow was so deep that no one could possibly reach the cabin, even if they knew where to look. And when spring came, they could reassess, make plans, perhaps even find a way to bring Sutton to justice. But fate, as it often does, had different plans. In late February, during a brief thaw, Kade made the trek down to Oatman to check in and pick up supplies he'd ordered the previous fall. Margaret wanted to come with him, but he convinced her to stay at the cabin where it was safer. He promised to be back within 2 days, kissed her goodbye, and set out through the slowly melting snow. Oatman was bustling with activity when he arrived, miners taking advantage of the brief warm spell to work their claims. Kade made his rounds, picking up supplies and catching up on gossip he'd missed during the winter months. It was at the general store that he heard the news that made his blood run cold. "Heard there's been some men in town asking questions," the proprietor mentioned casually as he tallied up Kade's purchases. "Well-dressed fellows, not miners. Showed up about 2 weeks ago during that last cold snap. Stayed at the boarding house and talked to everyone, asking about a woman who came through last summer." Kade kept his expression carefully neutral. "What kind of woman? Dark-haired, thin, running from something? Sound like anyone you might know?" "Can't say it does. Did these men find what they were looking for?" The proprietor shrugged. "Don't think so. They left after a few days, headed toward Kingman. But they seemed real determined, like they weren't going to stop looking until they found what they wanted." Kade finished his business as quickly as possible and went straight to see Marshal Davis. The lawman confirmed what the store owner had said, adding more details that made Kade's concern deepen. Dorothy. There were 3 of them, Davis explained in his office, away from prying ears. Professional looking, if you know what I mean. The kind of men who wear guns like they know how to use them. They asked about Margaret by name, showed a sketch around that was a fair likeness, said she was wanted for theft in California and they were authorized to bring her back. That's a lie, Kade said flatly. She didn't steal anything. She witnessed a murder. The marshal's eyebrows rose. That's so? Well, I suspected something wasn't right about their story. A woman desperate enough to walk through the desert in August doesn't fit the profile of a common thief. But they had papers that looked official enough, and I couldn't legally stop them from asking questions. Did anyone tell them about me? Davis hesitated, which was answer enough. Mrs. Fletcher might have mentioned that you'd taken Margaret up to your cabin. She was worried about the girl, wanted to make sure these men understood that Margaret had protection. I don't think she realized she might be putting you both in danger. Kade cursed under his breath. How long ago did they leave? Week and a half, but with the snow still deep in the high country, they wouldn't have been able to reach your place yet. You've got some time. Not enough time, Kade thought grimly. If Sutton's men were determined enough to brave winter in the mountains, they'd find a way. And when they did, Margaret would be vulnerable, alone at the cabin with only her recently acquired shooting skills to defend herself. He thanked the marshal and immediately began preparing to leave, loading his mule with supplies in record time. The sun was already beginning to set, which meant he'd be traveling through the night, but he couldn't afford to wait until morning. Every hour he delayed was an hour Margaret was unprotected. The trip back up the mountain was treacherous in the dark, but Kade pushed hard, trusting his horse to find safe footing while he watched for any sign of other travelers. The snow had melted enough in the lower elevations to show tracks, and about halfway up, he found what he was looking for and dreading in equal measure: 3 sets of horse tracks heading up toward his cabin. They were recent, made within the last day or two based on how crisp the edges remained, and they were moving carefully, the kind of slow, methodical pace men used when they were tracking prey and didn't want to give away their presence. Kade urged his horse into a faster pace, abandoning caution for speed. If Sutton's men reached the cabin before he did, if they hurt Margaret, he would make them regret the day they were born. The thought of her facing those killers alone made something primal and violent rise in his chest, a protective fury he hadn't felt since the war. The cabin came into view just before dawn, smoke rising from the chimney as Margaret prepared breakfast, completely unaware of the danger approaching. Kade was about to call out to her when movement in the trees caught his attention. 3 men were positioned around the cabin at strategic points, clearly preparing to move in. They hadn't seen Kade yet, their attention focused on the structure and its lone occupant. He recognized the setup immediately as a professional operation. These weren't random thugs, these were killers who knew their business. Kade dismounted silently, leaving his horse ground tied in the trees, and moved into position. His rifle was in his hands, loaded and ready, and his mind fell back into the cold tactical thinking that had kept him alive during the war. 3 targets, spread out, armed and dangerous. He'd need to take them quickly and decisively before any of them could reach Margaret. The man closest to him was crouched behind a fallen log, his attention fixed on the cabin door. Kade moved like a ghost through the forest, using every bit of cover available until he was within 10 feet. Then he stepped out and leveled his rifle at the man's back. "Don't move," he said quietly. The man froze, then slowly turned his head. He was in his 30s, hard-faced and cold-eyed, with a gun belt worn low on his hip. "Well, now, you must be Yates. We were hoping to handle this before you got back." "Guess you're out of luck. Drop your gun, slowly." The man complied, letting his revolver fall into the snow. "You know why we're here. Give us the woman and we'll leave peaceable." "Not happening. She's under my protection." "Protection?" The man actually smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Friend, you have no idea who you're dealing with. Richard Sutton wants that woman dead, and he's paying us a small fortune to make it happen. You really want to die for someone you barely know?" "I know her well enough," Kade replied, "and I've killed men for less reason than protecting the woman I love. So I'll give you one chance to walk away. Take your partners, leave this mountain, and never come back." The man's eyes flickered to something behind Kade, and that tiny tell was the only warning he got before a shot rang out. Kade dove to the side on pure instinct, feeling the bullet pass close enough to tug at his coat. He rolled, bringing his rifle up, and fired in one smooth motion. The second man, who'd been creeping up behind him, went down with a cry. The first man scrambled for his gun, but Kade was faster, swinging his rifle around and firing again. The shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling into the snow. "Kade!" Margaret's voice, terrified and calling from the cabin. She appeared in the doorway with the revolver he'd given her, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "Get back inside," Kade shouted, already moving toward the cabin. The third man was somewhere out there, probably repositioning after the gunfire, and Margaret was now exposed. Another shot cracked through the air, and wood splintered from the doorframe inches from Margaret's head. She ducked back inside with a scream, and Kade's vision went red with fury. He charged toward where the shot had originated, abandoning all caution, driven by the single-minded need to eliminate the threat to Margaret. The third man stepped out from behind a pine tree, his rifle already aimed at Kade's chest. Time seemed to slow as Kade saw his finger tighten on the trigger, knowing he couldn't bring his own weapon to bear in time. This was it, the moment death finally caught up with him after all these years. Then Margaret's revolver barked from the cabin window, and the third man jerked sideways as her bullet took him in the side. It wasn't a killing shot, but it was enough to throw off his aim. His rifle fired, the bullet going wide, and Kade didn't waste the opportunity. He closed the distance in 3 long strides and slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's face, dropping him instantly. The clearing fell silent, except for the harsh breathing of the 2 wounded men and Kade's own pounding heartbeat. He stood there for a moment, rifle still raised, scanning the forest for any additional threats. When he was satisfied they were alone, he turned to the cabin. Margaret burst out the door and ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with such force she nearly knocked him over. She was shaking violently, her face buried against his chest, and he could feel the rapid hammer of her heart. "It's all right," he murmured, holding her tight with one arm while keeping his rifle ready with the other. "It's over. You're safe." "I was so scared," she gasped. "I heard the shots and I thought they'd killed you. Takes more than these fools to put me down." He kissed the top of her head, relief flooding through him. "You did good, Margaret. That shot you made saved my life." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes still wide with adrenaline and fear. "I've never shot at a person before. I didn't even think. I just saw him about to shoot you and You did exactly right," Kade assured her. "Now get back inside while I deal with these men." The man Kade had shot in the shoulder was still conscious, groaning in pain and clutching his wound. The one Margaret had shot was unconscious, but breathing. The one Kade had hit with the rifle butt was also out cold. Kade quickly secured all 3 with rope from his supplies, binding them tightly and checking their wounds to make sure none of them would bleed out before he decided what to do with them. When he was satisfied they were secure, he went back into the cabin where Margaret was huddled by the fire, still shaking. He knelt beside her and took her hands in his. "We need to talk about what comes next," he said gently. "These men were sent by Sutton, and when they don't report back, he'll send more. We can't stay here anymore, Margaret. It's not safe." "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Kade. I've ruined everything. This was your home, your safe place, and I brought violence right to your door." "You didn't bring anything," he said firmly. "Sutton did this, not you, and now we're going to end it." She looked at him with confusion. "End it? How?" "By going on the offensive instead of running." Kade stood and began pacing, his tactical mind already forming a plan. "Sutton sent 3 men after you, and those 3 men are going to disappear without a trace. That'll make him cautious, make him wonder what happened. While he's off balance, we're going to gather evidence and witnesses and take it to someone who can actually do something about it." "I told you. He owns the law in California." "Then we don't go to the law in California. We go to the federal marshals, the ones who aren't on his payroll. We go to newspapers and make your story public. We make so much noise that Sutton can't sweep it under the rug anymore." Kade stopped pacing and looked at her intently. "But I need to know you're with me on this. It's going to be dangerous, and there's no guarantee it'll work. We could end up dead or on the run for the rest of our lives." Margaret stood, her fear transforming into determination right before his eyes. "I'm with you. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. Catherine deserves justice, and if there's even a chance we can make Sutton pay for what he did, I have to try. Then here's what we're going to do. Over the next several hours, Kade interrogated the 3 captured men, extracting information with a combination of pressure and pragmatism. The one he'd shot in the shoulder, a man named Dutch, proved the most talkative once Kade pointed out that his employer had essentially sent him on a suicide mission without proper intelligence. Sutton's desperate, Dutch admitted through gritted teeth as Kade bandaged his wound. The longer the girl stays alive, the more nervous he gets. He's got people watching all the ports and train stations, got every bounty hunter west of the Mississippi looking for her. That's how we tracked her here through the network. Someone in Kingman saw a woman matching her description and sent word. Who else knows about this place? Kade demanded. Just us and whoever we reported to. But when we don't check in, they'll send more. Sutton won't stop until she's dead. Kade nodded slowly. Then we make sure he stops. He looked at the 3 bound men. I'm going to give you a choice. You can take a message back to Sutton for me, or you can stay here and freeze to death when I leave. What's it going to be? The 3 men exchanged glances, and Dutch finally nodded. What's the message? Tell Sutton that Margaret Rose is under the protection of Kade Yates, and if he sends anyone else after her, I'll come for him personally. Tell him I'm a veteran of the war, that I've killed more men than he's hired, and that I don't care how much money or power he has. If he wants her, he'll have to go through me, and I promise, that's a fight he'll lose. It was a bold statement, bordering on suicidal, but Kade was counting on Sutton's arrogance. Men like him weren't used to direct challenges from people they considered beneath them. The threat would either make him back off to reconsider his approach, buying them time, or it would make him angry enough to come personally, which would give them the confrontation they needed. Kade released the 3 men with their weapons, but no horses, forcing them to walk back down the mountain. He kept their mounts and supplies as compensation for the attack, and he made sure they understood that if they tried to come back, he wouldn't be as merciful. After they disappeared into the trees, Margaret came to stand beside him. Do you really think threatening him will work? I think it'll make him pause, at least for a little while, and that's all we need. He turned to her and cupped her face in his hands. Pack everything you want to keep. We're leaving the cabin today. Where will we go? First to Oatman, to talk to Marshal Davis and send some telegrams. Then to Prescott, where there's a federal marshal's office. We're going to build a case against Sutton that's too big to ignore. They spent the rest of the day packing, loading supplies onto horses and the mule. Margaret moved through the cabin with tears in her eyes, touching the furniture Kade had built, the curtains she'd sewn, all the small touches that had transformed it from a bachelor's rough shelter into a home. We'll come back, Kade promised, watching her grief. When this is over, when Sutton's behind bars or dead, we'll come back here and build the life we want. Do you really believe that's possible? I have to believe it, he said simply, because the alternative is unacceptable. They reached Oatman as evening fell, the town quiet in the cold February darkness. Marshal Davis listened to their story with a grave expression, taking notes and asking questions that showed he was taking the situation seriously. This is bigger than anything I can handle locally, he admitted. But I know the federal marshal in Prescott, good man named Franklin Hayes. If anyone can help you build a case against someone like Sutton, it's him. He wrote out a letter of introduction and handed it to Kade. You take this to him, tell him everything you told me, and you be careful. Men with Sutton's kind of power have long reaches. They left for Prescott the next morning, a journey that would take several days through still winter conditions. Kade kept them moving fast, always watching their back trail for signs of pursuit. At night, they camped in hidden spots off the main trail, taking turns keeping watch. It was during one of those nights, huddled together for warmth under a shared blanket with the stars brilliant overhead, that Margaret finally said what had been building between them for months. When this is over, if we survive it, I want to marry you. Kade looked down at her, seeing the firelight reflected in her eyes. That's supposed to be my line. Then say it. Margaret Rose, when we get through this, when we've made Sutton pay, and you're free to live your life without fear, will you marry me? Yes, she said immediately. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They kissed then, sealing the promise with their lips and their hearts, and for that moment, The danger surrounding them seemed far away. They had each other, they had hope, and they had a plan. It would have to be enough. Prescott was larger than Oatman, a proper territorial capital with government buildings and a growing population. Marshal Franklin Hayes proved to be exactly what they needed. A no-nonsense lawman in his 40s who'd built his reputation on taking down corrupt officials and powerful criminals. He listened to Margaret's story without interruption, his weathered face growing darker as she described her sister's murder and Sutton's subsequent hunt for her. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This is complicated," he said finally. "Sutton has legitimate power in California, and going after him without ironclad evidence is dangerous. But if what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, then we can't let him continue to get away with murder." He looked at Kade. "You understand what you're asking here. We'll need to take this to court, which means Margaret will have to testify publicly. That puts a target on both your backs." "That target's already there," Kade replied. "At least this way we're fighting back." Hayes nodded approvingly. "I like your spirit. All right, here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to send telegrams to contacts I have in Sacramento and San Francisco, people I trust who can dig into Sutton's background quietly. If he killed one woman, chances are there's other dirt we can find. Second, I want to take formal statements from both of you, get everything on record. Third, we're going to need to keep you both somewhere safe while this investigation plays out. Sutton will hear about it eventually, and when he does, he'll make a move." "How long will this take?" Margaret asked. "Weeks at least, maybe months. Building a case against someone like Sutton isn't quick work." Hayes stood and extended his hand to Kade. "But I promise you, I won't rest until we've brought him to justice. Your sister deserves that much, Miss Rose." The weeks that followed were tense and strange, a combination of tedious waiting and constant vigilance. Hayes arranged for them to stay in a small house on the outskirts of Prescott, under protection from deputies he trusted personally. Kade chafed at the confinement, used to the freedom of the mountains, but he endured it for Margaret's sake. They fell into a domestic routine that felt like playing house, cooking meals together, and maintaining the small dwelling, always aware that it was temporary, but trying to enjoy it nonetheless. At night, they would lie in bed and make plans for the future they hoped to have, talking about rebuilding the cabin larger, maybe starting a horse ranch, having children who would grow up wild and free in the mountains. "How many children do you want?" Margaret asked one night, her head on his chest as they listened to rain pattering on the roof. "Never thought about it much before I met you," Kade admitted. "But now, I think 3 or 4. Enough to make the cabin lively, not so many that we can't feed them all." 3 or 4, Margaret repeated, smiling. "I like that. I always wanted a big family. Catherine and I were so close growing up. I want our children to have that kind of bond with each other." "They will," Kade promised. "We'll make sure of it." In late March, Hayes finally called them to his office with news. His expression was grim but satisfied, the look of a man who'd found what he was searching for. "We've got him," he said without preamble, spreading documents across his desk. "Sutton's been careful, but not careful enough. My contacts found records of 4 other women connected to him who died under suspicious circumstances over the past 10 years. 2 wives before Catherine, and 1 mistress. All ruled accidents or natural causes, but the pattern is clear. Additionally, we found evidence of bribes paid to law enforcement and judges, and testimony from servants who were willing to talk once they knew they'd be protected." Margaret's hand found Kade's and squeezed tight. "Is it enough?" "It's enough to bring charges and force a trial. But here's where it gets tricky. Sutton's legal team is the best money can buy, and they'll fight this every step of the way. The trial will likely be in Sacramento, which is his territory. We'll need you there to testify, Margaret, and it won't be easy. They'll try to destroy your credibility, make you look like a liar or a thief or worse." "I can handle it," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever they throw at me, I can handle it. I need to do this for Catherine." Hayes nodded approvingly. "There's one more thing. I've arranged for security during the trial, but once word gets out that we're moving forward with charges, Sutton will almost certainly make another attempt on your life. Are you both prepared for that reality?" "We've been living with that reality for months," Kade said. "Bring him on." The journey to Sacramento took 2 weeks, traveling with an escort of federal marshals Hayes trusted. Kade never left Margaret's side, his hand never far from his gun, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Twice they had to change their route due to reports of suspicious men watching the roads, and once they barely avoided an ambush when Kade spotted tracks that shouldn't have been there. Sacramento was hot and crowded, a far cry from the mountain wilderness Kade had come to love. The city felt oppressive, all noise and dirt and too many people packed too close together. But it was also where they would finally face Sutton and, hopefully, end the nightmare that had consumed Margaret's life. The trial was set to begin in mid-April, giving them only a week to prepare after their arrival. Hayes introduced them to the prosecuting attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Elizabeth Crawford, who had a reputation for taking on powerful men and winning. She spent hours with Margaret, going over her testimony and preparing her for the brutal cross-examination she would face. "They're going to say you're lying to cover up your own crimes," Crawford warned. "They're going to bring up every mistake you've ever made, every questionable decision, and paint you as an unreliable witness. Can you handle that?" "I have to," Margaret replied, "because it's the truth, and Catherine deserves to have the truth told." Kade sat in on these sessions, his presence a silent support that Margaret drew strength from. He watched her transform from the frightened, traumatized woman who'd stumbled into Oatman into someone fierce and determined, ready to face down the man who'd destroyed her sister and tried to destroy her. The day before the trial was set to begin, Sutton made his move. Kade and Margaret were returning to the house Hayes had arranged for them, accompanied by 2 deputy marshals, when shots rang out from a rooftop across the street. One deputy went down immediately, and the other shoved Margaret toward cover while drawing his weapon. Kade was already moving, pulling Margaret behind a water trough while returning fire at the roof. More shots came from ground level, and Kade realized with cold clarity that this was a coordinated attack. Multiple shooters, probably hired professionals, all focused on one goal: eliminating Margaret before she could testify. "Stay down," he ordered Margaret, then turned to the remaining deputy. "Cover me. I'm going to flank around and take out the ones on the ground." "Are you crazy? There's at least 4 of them." "Then I better move fast." Kade reloaded his revolver and sprinted across the street, using wagons and storefronts for cover. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet, but he'd been under fire before and knew how to move in combat. He reached an alley and disappeared into it, circling around to come at the shooters from an unexpected angle. He found 2 men positioned behind a stack of crates, their attention focused on where Margaret was hiding. Kade didn't give them a chance to react, dropping both with quick shots before they even realized he was there. 2 down, at least 2 more to go, plus whoever was on the roof. Screams filled the street as civilians ran for cover, and Kade heard the thunder of more gunfire. The deputy marshal was giving as good as he got, but he was pinned down and couldn't move to protect Margaret. Kade had to end this quickly. He spotted the 3rd shooter trying to work around to Margaret's position and intercepted him, tackling the man before he could fire. They grappled in the dirt, trading punches, the shooter trying to bring his gun to bear while Kade fought to keep the barrel pointed away. The man was strong and trained, but Kade had 8 years of survival in the wilderness and pure, desperate fury on his side. He got his hand on a rock and brought it crashing into the shooter's temple, dropping him instantly. A bullet cracked past Kade's head, and he rolled behind a wagon just as the 4th shooter opened up from across the street. This one had better positioning and better aim, and Kade realized he couldn't rush him without getting shot. He needed another approach. Then Margaret's voice rang out, clear and strong despite the terror she must be feeling. "Richard Sutton sent these men to kill me because I witnessed him murder my sister Catherine. Everyone here is a witness to this attempted assassination." It was a brilliant move, turning the attack itself into evidence against Sutton. Several people had taken cover in doorways and behind windows, watching the chaos, and Margaret's shout ensured they all knew exactly what was happening and why. The 4th shooter hesitated, probably realizing that killing her now, in front of dozens of witnesses, would make Sutton's guilt undeniable. That moment of hesitation was all Kade needed. He came around the wagon firing, and the shooter went down clutching his leg. The rooftop shooter was still out there, and Kade had just exposed himself. He dove back behind the wagon as a bullet smashed into the wood inches from his head. He needed to get to Margaret to make sure she was still safe, but the shooter had the high ground and could pick him off if he tried to cross the street. Then, the distinctive boom of a shotgun echoed through the street, and Kade looked up to see Marshal Hayes on an adjacent rooftop, having just removed the final threat. The street fell silent except for moaning from the wounded shooters and the sobbing of frightened civilians. "Everyone all right?" Hayes called down. Kade ran to where Margaret was crouched behind the water trough, pulling her into his arms. She was shaking but unharmed, her green eyes blazing with righteous anger rather than fear. "I'm all right," she assured him. "Is it over?" "For now." Kade looked at the carnage in the street, the wounded men being secured by arriving lawmen, the crowd of witnesses who'd seen everything. "But you just guaranteed that Sutton won't be able to talk his way out of this. Everyone here saw what happened." Hayes climbed down from the roof and joined them, his expression grim. "The deputy who went down first is alive, just grazed. We got lucky." He looked at the captured shooters. "I'll make sure these men testify about who hired them. Between that and your testimony tomorrow, Miss Rose, we'll have Sutton dead to rights." The trial began the next day, in a packed courthouse, every seat filled with spectators eager to see the powerful Richard Sutton brought low. Kade sat in the front row behind Margaret, his presence a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Sutton himself cut an impressive figure, dressed in an expensive suit and exuding the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of getting whatever he wanted. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that swept the courtroom with disdain. When his gaze fell on Margaret, Kade saw pure hatred there, and his hand instinctively moved toward his gun before he remembered where he was. The prosecution laid out their case methodically, starting with the pattern of dead women connected to Sutton, then moving to the evidence of bribes and corruption. Servants testified about Sutton's violent temper and Catherine's fear in the months before her death. Doctors presented evidence that Catherine's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall down the stairs. Through it all, Sutton maintained an expression of bored annoyance, as if the entire proceeding was beneath him. His attorneys objected constantly, trying to suppress evidence and discredit witnesses, but Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, wasn't having it. When Margaret finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Every eye was on her as she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Kade could see her hands trembling, but her voice was steady as Crawford began her questioning. "Miss Rose, can you tell us what you witnessed on the evening of October 12th, 1878? "I was visiting my sister Catherine at her home in Sacramento," Margaret began, her eyes finding Kade's and drawing strength from his steady gaze. "We were supposed to have dinner together. I let myself in with the key she'd given me, and I heard her screaming from upstairs. I ran up, and I saw Richard Sutton at the top of the staircase with Catherine. They were arguing. She was trying to get away from him, and he grabbed her and pushed her down the stairs." "You're certain it was Richard Sutton?" "Absolutely certain. I'd met him many times before, and after she fell he looked right at me. Our eyes met. He knew I'd seen everything." "What happened then?" "I ran. I knew if I stayed, he'd kill me too. I heard him calling for his men as I fled the house. I've been running ever since." The cross-examination was brutal, just as Crawford had warned. Sutton's lead attorney, a slick-talking man named Harrison, tried every tactic to discredit Margaret. He suggested she was lying to cover up her own crime, that she was jealous of her sister's wealth, that she was mentally unstable. But Margaret held firm, answering each accusation with calm dignity, never wavering from her core testimony. When Harrison tried to suggest that Margaret and Kade had concocted the whole story together for financial gain, Kade had to physically restrain himself from standing up and defending her. But Margaret didn't need him to fight this battle for her. "Mr. Yates saved my life by giving me shelter when I had nowhere else to go," she said clearly. "He asked for nothing in return, and he's put himself in danger repeatedly to protect me. If you're trying to suggest he's somehow involved in a conspiracy, then you clearly don't know what kind of man he is." The testimony from the captured shooters sealed Sutton's fate. One by one, they admitted under oath that they'd been hired by Sutton's people to kill Margaret Rose, with the promise of substantial payment upon completion. The attempted assassination in broad daylight, witnessed by dozens of Sacramento citizens, made it impossible to dismiss their confessions as fabrication. The trial lasted 5 days in total, and when Judge Morrison finally instructed the jury to deliberate, the tension in the courthouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kade held Margaret's hand as they waited, her fingers cold despite the warm April day. The jury returned in less than 2 hours with a guilty verdict on all counts, including murder, conspiracy, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice. Sutton's face turned purple with rage as the verdict was read, and he had to be physically restrained by bailiffs when he tried to lunge toward Margaret. "You're dead!" he screamed as they dragged him from the courtroom. "You hear me? You're both dead! I'll kill you myself!" Judge Morrison slammed her gavel. "Mr. Sutton, you're going to be too busy serving a life sentence in Yuma Territorial Prison to threaten anyone. Bailiffs, remove him." As Sutton was led away in chains, still screaming threats, Margaret collapsed against Kade with a sob of relief. It was over. After months of fear and running and fighting, it was finally over. Catherine's death had been avenged, and Sutton would spend the rest of his days behind bars. Hayes approached them in the courthouse hallway afterward, shaking Kade's hand firmly. "You two did good work. Both of you showed real courage seeing this through." "Thank you for believing us," Margaret said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Thank you for helping us fight." "Just doing my job, madam, but I will say this is one of the most satisfying victories I've had in years." Hayes pulled out a document and handed it to Kade. "This is a letter clearing both of you of any charges or suspicion. You're free to go wherever you want, live however you want. Sutton's assets are being seized to compensate his victims' families, and there will be a substantial amount coming to you, Miss Rose, as Catherine's next of kin." Margaret shook her head. "I don't want his money. Give it to charity to help other women escaping dangerous men." Hayes smiled. "I'll make sure that's arranged. Now, what will you two do?" Kade looked at Margaret, and she looked back at him, and they both knew the answer without speaking. "We're going home," Kade said simply. "Back to the mountains." They were married in Oatman 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony at the small church with Mrs. Fletcher and Marshall Davis as witnesses. Margaret wore a new dress Mrs. Fletcher had sewn for her, and Kade wore his cleanest clothes with his hair freshly trimmed and his beard neatly groomed. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect, just the two of them promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. After the ceremony, they rode back up to the cabin together as husband and wife, ready to begin the life they'd fought so hard to build. The mountain was beautiful in late spring, wildflowers blooming across the meadows and the streams running high with snowmelt. Everything felt fresh and full of possibility. The cabin needed work after being abandoned for months, but they threw themselves into the task with enthusiasm. They repaired the roof and cleaned thoroughly, planted an expanded garden, and built additional storage for the life they planned. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch Kade built, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, and talk about the future. "I want our first child to be born here," Margaret said one evening, her hand resting on her stomach. She wasn't pregnant yet, but they both knew it was only a matter of time. "In this cabin, in these mountains. I want them to know from their first breath that they're safe and loved." "They will be," Kade promised. "All our children will be. We'll make sure of it." Their first child, a boy they named Christopher, was born in February of 1880 during a snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Kade delivered his son with shaking hands and a prayer on his lips, and when he heard that first cry, tears streamed down his face. Margaret, exhausted but radiant, held their baby close and whispered promises of love and protection. Christopher was followed by a daughter, Sarah, in 1882, and another son, James, in 1884. The cabin Kade expanded to accommodate their growing family, adding rooms and building proper furniture that would last generations. The children grew up wild and free, learning to hunt and fish and survive in the wilderness, but also learning kindness and compassion from their mother's gentle influence. They made regular trips to Oatman, where the children played with the miners' kids while Kade and Margaret caught up on news and traded supplies. The town grew over the years, becoming more established, and the Yates family became something of a legend, the mysterious mountain man and the woman he'd saved, who'd stood up to a powerful tyrant and won. On their 10th anniversary, Kade took Margaret back to the spot where they'd first really talked, near the stream where she'd learned to wash clothes in the cold water. They were older now, weathered by sun and wind and the hard work of mountain living, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "Do you ever regret it?" Kade asked, holding her close. "Giving up the chance at a civilized life for this isolation?" Margaret laughed, the sound as beautiful as it had been the first time he'd heard it. "Regret it? Kade, this is the life I was meant to live. These mountains, this family, you. This is everything I never knew I needed. I wouldn't change a single moment. Even the scary parts? Especially the scary parts, because they led me here, to you. She turned in his arms and kissed him deeply. I love you, Kade Yates. Thank you for trusting me when I had secrets too dark to tell. Thank you for giving me the chance to heal. I love you too, Margaret Yates, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. They stood there together as the sun set behind the mountains, two people who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. The wilderness stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and dangerous and honest, just like the love they shared. In the cabin, their children waited for them to return, safe and warm and loved. And in Sacramento, Richard Sutton rotted in prison, his empire dismantled, his crimes exposed, justice finally served. But that was all in the past now. What mattered was the present, this moment, this life they'd built together. They'd survived the worst the world could throw at them and come out stronger on the other side. They'd kept their promises to each other, protected their family, and created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Kade and Margaret walked hand in hand back to their cabin, back to their children, back to the life they'd earned through courage and faith and unwavering trust in each other. They were home, truly home, and they would never have to run again. The years continued to pass in gentle rhythm, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing children. Christopher grew tall and strong like his father, learning to track animals through the forest with the same skill Kade had mastered over decades. Sarah inherited her mother's grace and sharp mind, teaching herself to read from the few books they kept in the cabin and constantly asking questions about the world beyond the mountains. James, the youngest, was a quiet observer who seemed to understand the language of the wilderness on an instinctive level. When Christopher turned 18 in 1898, he announced his intention to join the army, wanting to see the world beyond the mountains. Kade understood the urge, having felt it himself at that age, but Margaret worried for her eldest son's safety. "The world out there isn't kind," she said to Christopher the night before he left. "I learned that the hard way." "I know, Ma. But you and Pa also taught me that running from the world isn't the answer. You taught me to stand and fight for what's right." Christopher hugged his mother tight. "I'll come back. I promise." And he did, 3 years later, with stories of faraway places and a newfound appreciation for the simple beauty of mountain life. He settled in Oatman, opening a general store, and marrying a sweet-natured woman named Emma, giving Kade and Margaret their first grandchild in 1903. Sarah became a teacher, traveling to settlements throughout the territory and eventually establishing a school in Oatman specifically for children who lived in remote areas. She never married, declaring herself perfectly happy with her books and her students, and Kade and Margaret respected her choice, even as they secretly hoped she might find someone who made her eyes light up the way Margaret still lit up when she looked at Kade. James stayed on the mountain, building his own cabin a few miles from his parents' place, and living much as his father had before meeting Margaret, a solitary existence in harmony with nature. But he visited often, and there was no loneliness in his solitude, only contentment. Kade and Margaret grew old together in their mountain refuge, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming weathered and gnarled from decades of hard work. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by time and trials into something unbreakable. On quiet evenings, they would still sit on the porch and watch the sunset, holding hands and remembering. They spoke of Catherine sometimes, honoring her memory by living the full and beautiful life she'd been denied. They spoke of the long journey from fear and trauma to peace and joy, marveling at how far they'd come. "Do you remember what those people in Oatman said?" Margaret asked one such evening when she was 72 and Kade was 76. "When you first offered to help me? They warned you that I had secrets too dark to tell." Kade squeezed her hand gently. "And I told you to keep them, that I trusted you. Best decision I ever made. You saved my life, you know. In every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," Kade replied. "I was just existing up here before you came along, not really living. You gave me purpose, a reason to be more than just a hermit hiding from the world." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, one by one, in the darkening sky. 3 generations of their family lived within a day's ride, children and grandchildren who bore the legacy of their courage and love. The cabin that had once sheltered just one lonely man now stood as the heart of a family that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. When Kade passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1912 at the age of 78, Margaret held his hand and whispered words of love until his final breath. She mourned him deeply, but without regret, knowing they had had more years together than many people were blessed with, and that every one of those years had been filled with genuine love and partnership. She lived another 5 years after that, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still sharp-minded and kind-hearted until the very end. When she joined Kade in 1917, the family buried them side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, beneath the vast Montana sky they'd both loved so much. Their story became legend in Oatman and the surrounding territories, passed down through generations. The mountain man who'd trusted a stranger with dark secrets, and the brave woman who'd stood up to a killer and won. The couple who'd built a life of love and purpose in the unforgiving wilderness, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and trust and courage could prevail. The cabin still stood for decades after, maintained by James and then by his children, a monument to the enduring power of love. Visitors would sometimes make the trek up the mountain to see it, to stand in the place where Kade and Margaret had built their sanctuary and raised their family. And if those visitors stood very quiet on the porch at sunset, they might almost hear the echo of laughter and whispered endearments, might almost see 2 figures sitting hand in hand, watching the day give way to night, together as they'd always been and always would be, bound by a love that transcended even death itself. The story of Kade Yates and Margaret Rose was one of darkness transformed into light, of secrets that led to salvation rather than destruction, of trust given and honored, of love that conquered fear and built something beautiful and lasting. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that no matter how dark the secrets, no matter how terrible the circumstances, redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it and wise enough to trust in the goodness of others. And so their legacy lived on, in the mountains they'd loved, in the family they'd created, and in the hearts of everyone who heard their tale and found hope in its message. Some secrets were indeed too dark to tell, but with the right person beside you, someone who offered trust instead of judgment, those secrets could be transformed into the foundation of something beautiful, something eternal, something worth fighting for with every breath in your body. Kade and Margaret had found that beautiful thing in each other, against all odds, and they'd protected it fiercely until their final days. Their story was complete, their ending earned through courage and devotion, their love immortalized in the very stones of the mountain that had sheltered them. It was, in the end, exactly the happily ever after they'd both fought so hard to achieve.